Hey there. Welcome to 1930s in film class. And today we're going to talk about the classic of the Western genre, 1939's Stagecoach. So you have a couple of readings for this week. You have a selection from Richard Jewell's The Golden Age of Hollywood about the Western, which kind of introduces you to the genre. And then you also have a reading by Barry Keith Grant, the introductory chapter to his book about this movie called John Ford's Stagecoach from 2003. So one gives you kind of a setup about, or kind of a background about the Western genre in general, and then the other gives you some specific information about the film today. So the Western film genre has been called the, quote, foundational myth for American culture. I think Jewell actually says this in the reading. It's an explicitly American film genre based on a nostalgia to about the days of white expansion into what was seen at the time as this expansive, untamed frontier, with its heroes navigating the border between civilization and wilderness. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that are problematic about this myth, but this is sort of the foundational myth of the Western. Historically, many Westerns are often set on the American frontier during the last part of the 19th century following the Civil War. So sort of, the late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. In a geographically sort of Western or trans-Mississippi setting with romantic, sweeping frontier landscapes or a rugged rural terrain. Typically Westerns is a genre of rural areas. And while there might be towns in them, and you'll see this in Stagecoach, really sort of the place of the genre is the wide expanse of the frontier, at least how that is imagined. And one thing that we can definitely talk about in class in relation to the movie, as well as in connection to other Westerns that you've seen, are what are the tropes, the themes, the characters, the scenes, etc., that we associate with Westerns. So just to give you, we all kind of know what Westerns are, but just to sort of define a little more precisely, some of the themes associated with the Western. And this isn't just film, right? This can be television, this can be literature, this is all sorts of kinds of pop culture. So some of the themes are the conquest of the wilderness and subordination of nature in the name of civilization, right? White civilization, of course, we know, which often includes taking land from indigenous peoples. And the portrayal of indigenous peoples is also often quite problematic in Westerns. Also, the mythic role of violence in white expansion into the frontier and sort of the necessity of violence. The idea of rugged individualism, and this is often sort of embodied in the main character. The conflict between the individual and society, this is definitely something we'll see in Stagecoach. The challenges of American democracy, as well as the kind of democratic promise of the frontier, at least for white people. The character of the anti-hero, right, which is often associated with rugged individualism, and kind of the myth of the American dream, bootstrapping, in some ways the fantasy of a classless society. These are all kind of themes of the Western. We think of settings and elements that are common to Western, right? Long stretches of open prairie, isolated forts, ranch houses, isolated homesteads, the saloon, the jail, the horse stable, small town Main Street, small frontier towns that are just forming on the edge of white civilization. Also, trusty horses, showdowns on Main Street, the hanging tree, 10-gallon hats and spurs, saddles, lassos, Colt 45s, bandanas, buckskins, canteens, card games, stagecoaches, and cattle drives, right? These are all kind of aspects both of the historical West, but also they've kind of made their way and developed into this idea of the mythic West, and a lot of times kind of divorced from their historical accuracy. And in terms of characters, we think obviously of cowboys, heroic cowboys and villainous cowboys. And oftentimes in Westerns, often the heroic cowboy is an anti-hero. He's a reluctant hero who isn't necessarily this wholly virtuous person, but, kind of does the right thing in the end anyway. And we'll definitely see, I think, an anti-hero in Stagecoach. Also think of pioneers, farmers, ranchers, often, very sort of racist portrayals of, quote, uncivilized Native Americans. The West is also, full of not just cowboys as cowboys as heroes and villains, but also, other kinds of opportunists coming to the West, swindlers, cheaters, entrepreneurs, right? All of these kind of characters, frontier armies, right? Often battling with Native Americans and actually sometimes Spanish settlements. And one that you'll definitely see in Stagecoach, prostitutes with a heart of gold. That's an old cliche. So Stagecoach is directed by John Ford, probably one of the most renowned American film directors of the past 100 years, with a career lasting over 50 years. He started in the silent era and directed through the 1960s. He is known for westerns such as The Searchers in 1956, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962, but when he shot Stagecoach in 1939, it is the first time that he had filmed a Western movie in over a decade. He had done some Westerns in the silent era. So this is John Ford's first sound Western, and we're, a decade into sound at this point. So he becomes known for Westerns, but he had this sort of prolific career before then. His films also went beyond Westerns, and he is, which even though he's associated with that, he made films that weren't Westerns that were well received as well. He won the Academy Award for Best Director 4 times, which is a record. And all of them were for non-Westerns. 1935's The Informer, 1940's The Grapes of Wrath, 1941 How Green Was My Valley, and 1952's The Quiet Man. He also won 2 Best Documentary Academy Awards in 1942 and 1943 for government propaganda films that he did for the U.S. government during the war that were funded by the U.S. government, notably part of the Why We Fight series. So Stagecoach, 1939, which is kind of his first sound Western, and by many considered one of the greatest Westerns of film history, was a incredibly critically acclaimed and popular film. It received 7 Academy Award nominations for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, Best Score, Best Art Director, and Best Supporting Actor for Thomas Mitchell. And 1939 is considered an especially amazing year for movies, so it's not bad to not win many of those. It only won 2. Thomas Mitchell did win for Best Supporting Actor as Dr. Josiah Boone, and then also won for the score. That's the same year that Gone with the Wind won Best Picture, so, they really didn't have a shot at that for Best Picture for Stagecoach. So remember, this is post-code. This is a good 6 years into the production code. 6 years into the production code at this point. So the production code office, the censorship office, the Hays Code office, was sent a treatment for Stagecoach before a script was made. So this is a pretty common practice. So a studio, it's kind of a pre-script with a story and a character summary. Nowadays, a treatment is what you write to shop around and get a studio to write your film, or to pick up your film. But this is when, writers were in-house at studio, and so, they had an idea for a film, and they'd write sort of the treatment and then send it to the production code office. But the production code office actually had some criticisms. So because the original treatment, the original story and character summaries in the treatment seemingly were too sympathetic portrayal of Dallas, the prostitute with the heart of gold, Doc Boone, who Thomas Mitchell won an Academy Award for playing because of his constant drunkenness, the Ringo Kid, that's John Wayne's character, his thirst for revenge, and the marshal's involvement in some sort of nefarious dealings, especially some death. So the first draft of the script took to the production code's suggestions to heart. And then production went ahead without further objections from the censors. So, you're going to see that these characters, those broad sketches, kind of remained in place, but I want you to think about how these characters are written in the final script when you watch, and I wonder how they were maybe characterized in the treatment differently, or maybe a little more emphasizing their negative qualities, or maybe they weren't redeemed. What do you think happened to these characters in the treatment that made the production code office reject kind of the original treatment, and then why were they happy with the way that they are written in the film? So the film stars Claire Trevor as Dallas, the prostitute with the heart of gold, John Wayne as the Ringo Kid. Of course, John Wayne, incredibly famous actor, especially actor in Westerns in American history. He was already a pretty seasoned actor in this by the time 1939 came around, but he wasn't well known, and he wasn't well known as a hero and as kind of the protagonist. And so this is really one of the early films where, he's becoming a leading man and sort of known as the leading character in the film. Andy Devine as Buck, John Carradine as Hatfield. You may recognize the last name Carradine. It's kind of an acting dynasty in American history. There's Carradines acting now. Google the family name. Kind of like the Barrymores. As I said, Thomas Mitchell as Doc Boone or Dr. Zia Boone. And this is actually an actor that we've seen in multiple movies in this class. So we can talk a little bit about that. And a host of other kind of well-known character actors. So some of the things that I want you guys to think about when watching this film. And, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, the Western genre is often called the foundational myth for American culture. And not the West, not the actual historical West, but the fictional genre. So what aspects of Stagecoach support the myth of the West and the frontier? And what aspects of the film maybe question this myth? Think of tropes and themes of the Western and characters typical in the Western. What sort of plays into this myth, these myths of sort of the West and westward expansion, and what pushes against them? There's kind of this view among certain film scholars that character, Ringo Kid, John Wayne, the main character, is kind of destined to triumph because he is morally right. I mean, he's kind of an anti-hero, but he's morally right, sort of like America itself. So I want you to sort of think about how that character is embodying sort of Americanness and this foundational myth of American culture. And also think of the role of expansion and violence in that foundational myth of sort of the West. Also think about the characters in the film, especially the ones that ride in the stagecoach together, are often kind of criticized. A big criticism is that they're kind of one-dimensional caricatures. They're not really fully rounded, complex characters. While others argue, who've analyzed this film, that they are consciously presented as archetypes. Right? They're not supposed to be well-rounded characters. They're archetypes. What do you think? What purpose does the way the characters are presented serve? Some critics see Stagecoach as a good film, but not a great film because it relies too heavily on kind of these one-dimensional characters and some of the conventions of the Western genre to transcend them. However, the grant reading that I signed you contends that, quote, such judgment misses both the point and the power of Stagecoach, for popular cinema is also artful insofar as it works as cultural myth, particularly through the ritual repetitions of genre. So what are these sort of ritual repetitions, and how do the archetypical characters fit into it, and how do some of the other tropes and conventions of the Western fit into it in a way that helps kind of promote some of these cultural myths of the West? Also think about the fact that in the grant reading, the article points out that Stagecoach is often read as a metaphor for the challenges of American democracy and the democratic promise of the frontier. So think about how this works in the film. What is the specific argument, and how is sort of the stagecoach itself a metaphor for American democracy? Also think about the concept of, quote, civilization and how this is represented in the film. Who is civilized, quote, civilized, right? And who is not, and why? And how does sort of this conflict also connect to the conflict between individual and society? The conflict between sort of the moral individual and the demands of society. So think about that as well. So also kind of connected to this idea of who is, quote, civilized and who is uncivilized, think about how race and ethnicity are portrayed in the film. How are Native Americans, Hispanics, and Anglos represented? How did these groups interact with one another in this imagined West? And how is whiteness represented, especially in terms of region, right? Northern white people, Southern white people, and the West. What's interesting about the Western genre is that historically it often takes place in the decades after the Civil War. So, in some places the West is a space that offers sort of the opportunity to transcend that traditional Civil War North-South divide. maybe a space of reconciliation, at least for white people. And along those lines of race and ethnicity, think about some of the critiques of how Native Americans are portrayed in Stagecoach. You can think about if this is similar or different or both to the way other Western films have portrayed Native Americans throughout the genre's history, even until present day. So when you watch the film, I think it's going to be pretty easy to say that there's some problematic representations of Native Americans. That's true about a lot of Western films at this time. However, I want to complicate that a little bit and point this out when we talk about it. Stagecoach actually marked the beginning of a very long friendship between director John Ford and the Navajo peoples of Monument Valley. Monument Valley is sort of the area in the Southwest where you'll recognize the scene. A lot of films, a lot of Westerns are filmed there. And John Ford went back and filmed in that space a lot. And the Navajo Nation is in that area. So John Ford employed scores of local Native Americans to play Apache warriors in Stagecoach, as well as the various other tribes that are portrayed in many of his other Westerns. And more than 200 people were hired to film the climactic attack on the Stagecoach alone. And for his commitment to providing Navajo Nation peoples with much needed work, right? This is the Great Depression. He was paying them on a union scale, which was unusual for non-union workers. The Navajos actually gave Ford the name Nataninez, which means tall leader. And he actually had a pretty sort of productive and positive relationship with the Navajo Nation his whole career. So does that complicate sort of the way that we interpret the very kind of negative stereotypes and simplistic stereotypes promoted about Native Americans in the film? Also think about how gender and sexuality are portrayed in the film, how masculinity and femininity are constructed in various characters, and you think these uphold or question conventional representations of gender and sexuality in the 1930s. I think it's especially interesting, I think, to compare and contrast the characters of Dallas and Lucy. So Lucy's kind of like Southern sort of virtuous womanhood. Dallas is sort of Western prostitute with a heart of gold, and think about, how those characters are being presented. Also, John Ford's filmmaking style is often associated with the use of location shooting and the use of long shots or wide shots, where characters are often placed against a rugged and vast landscape. So how does Stagecoach use these technical aspects of Ford's style? And what specifically do they add to the film, especially these really wide shots of just this vast landscape? How does that help play into sort of the mythic West? Just a little kind of side note tidbit, this film included legendary stuntman Yakima Canute, and he should be noted for his contributions to the film. One scene, which when you watch the film, you'll very easily pick it out, required the stagecoach full of passengers to be floated across a river, which was deemed impossible by technicians to pull off, and John Ford kind of considered removing it from the script altogether. Canute, however, suggested using hollow logs tied to the coach. In addition, an underwater cable was used to help pull the stagecoach, and Canute's plan worked, and the scene was retained for the film. But it is for Canute's magnificent and dangerous stunts on this film that he is remembered today. In the most striking of these, he plays a Native American who rides alongside the coach at full speed, approximately 40 miles an hour, and transfers from the horse he's riding to a horse on the team. After he is shot by the Ringo Kid, John Wayne's character, he falls between the two lead horses and hangs from the rig before letting go and allowing the horses in the stagecoach to pass over him. The stunt, which was actually broken up in 2 segments to shoot, required precise timing and movement, since kind of any miscalculation could have been deadly for Yakima Canute. Steven Spielberg actually made an homage to this scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, when Indiana Jones is dragged down the hood of a moving car, passes underneath it, and dragged behind. So see if you can kind of see the Indiana Jones reference there. So final question. How does the film convey a sense of kind of America Old Westness? How do we know this is a historical film? What are some of the details that sort of try to make it seem historically accurate? Or is it historically, does that even matter? Is it really historically accurate what the Old West would have been like? Or is it more this sort of myth of the Old West, this popular conception of the Old West? And how would audiences in the late 1930s America, so sort of the end of the Great Depression, connect to this period of westward expansion? Why would they be sort of longing to consume this period and nostalgic for this period, after experiencing a decade-long economic depression? Especially the way kind of the West, the expansiveness, the democratic possibilities of the West, the sort of possibilities of reinventing yourself and starting anew. So we will talk about that and lots more when we talk about Stagecoach in our live class. So enjoy the film, and I will see you guys soon.